Hey Monster Hunters, if you're enjoying Beast and Bible, please rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen, and don't forget to share it with somebody who might like it. Now, on to the show. One year at Christmas, my siblings and I were given a set of VHS tapes called Popcorn Classics. They featured a variety of cartoon characters like Bugs Bunny, Foghorn Leghorn, and Porky Pig.
What's up, Doc?
The packaging was designed with colorful pinstripes to look like a box of theater popcorn. As we watched the videos, the usual elements of slapstick mayhem ensued. Sticks of dynamite blew out people's teeth, and dropping pianos on people's heads replaced teeth with piano keys. Colorful characters full of life ran amok across the screen, causing a lot of joy. But there was one cartoon that was different and featured a character that was a little, well, completely dead. This character's cartoon opened in a cemetery with ominous music and a scratchy, deep voice describing the terrors of ghost stories.
Now, isn't this a perfect setting for a spine-tingling ghost story? Well, strangely enough, this is a ghost story. Do you scare easily? Do you have nightmares? Do shadows on the wall front you?
And then it pivots to a little ghost reading a book called Animal Friends by a candlelit tombstone. While the other ghosts awaken to terrify human beings, Casper is a friendly ghost who wants to make friends. He sets off to look for a companion and proceeds to scare the daylights out of every single creature he meets, even as he announces his name and asks if he can be their friend. The only animal that is open to the ghost's friendship is a little fox pup he names Ferdy. The two become fast friends. Unfortunately, a fox hunting party chases the little fox before Casper can stop them. Even though Casper, the friendly ghost, politely asks the hunting party to stop, terrifying the dogs, the horse, and the hunter in the process, it's too late. The little fox lays limp, and Casper, weeping, carries his little lifeless body back to the cemetery to bury him, only to have him emerge as a ghost fox, so the two can presumably play together in their lonely afterlives. The cartoon isn't scary, it's not really funny, it's just sad. I mean, if the goal is to make kids laugh, lonely child ghosts and dead puppies is not the way to go. Now, if your goal is to traumatize people so they grow up with such a burden of sadness that the only way they can process it is to talk about it to an invisible audience on their podcast, then job well done. Of course, I'm being sarcastic. And I knew, growing up as a pastor's kid and going through Bible studies, that people didn't die to become ghosts that wander around looking for animal friends. When people died, they waited until the resurrection to have any kind of life again. And for that reason, I never became a big fan of Casper. I mean, why waste time with the melancholy specter when you can be dazzled by the tornado of spittle that is the Tasmanian devil? I should note, I did watch the live-action Casper in the 1995 movie, but that was only because I had a crush on Christina Ricci, who is the only Wednesday Addams I will recognize at this time in this podcast.
What are you, darling? Where's your costume?
This is my costume. I'm a homicidal maniac. They look just like everyone else.
Since then, I haven't given much thought to Casper's old cartoons, until I began to explore the connection between horror and holiness. That may seem like a weird, even inappropriate connection. However, if you stick with me, I believe you will not only see the connection, but also see how it gives us a fuller and more inspirational picture of the divine. When I was searching for a title for this episode, I came across an old Boyd Atkins song performed by Louis Armstrong called the Heebie Jeebies, which became a term popularized by Shaggy from Scooby-Doo in the late 60s to indicate a feeling of being scared or creeped out. So I've decided to entitle this episode the Heebie Holies. I'm Dr. Seth Pierce, and welcome to Beast and Bible. Many people of faith dream of being visited by the divine, either in person or even in a literal dream. The idea of having a multi-sensory encounter with one of the heavenly hosts feels like it would be an inspiring, joy-laden experience. And yet, there is a strange pattern in the Bible of God and angels showing up to give friendly greetings or good news to human beings, and the human beings tend to have a bit of a freak out. Whether it's a word of prophecy, blessing, or solidarity, almost every time a divine being enters the scene, they have to preface their message with the same point: don't be afraid. In Genesis 15:1, we come across the story of Abram basking in victory after saving his nephew Lot from the king of Sodom. The Lord shows up to give Abram a promise of defense and multiplying his offspring. Even though this is good news, the Lord begins with, "Don't be afraid." What's more is if you keep reading the story, the Lord gives Abram a dream in verses 13 to 16, where he tells him that even though his descendants will become slaves, God will be their deliverer, and Abram, quote, "shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried at a good old age," end quote. What would you expect a prophetic dream to feel like? What emotions and sensations would you experience if the Lord had a good word to share with you while you slumbered? Here's a hint. It's closer to a nightmare rather than a sweet dream. According to this verse, anyways. Before the Lord speaks, verse 12 gives us the vibe, and we'll look at this in multiple versions. The first version is the NIV. Quote, "As the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him." End quote. The New American Standard translates it, quote, "Now when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and behold, terror and great darkness fell upon him." End quote. The Message paraphrase puts it this way: "As the sun went down, a deep sleep overcame Abram, and then a sense of dread, dark and heavy." My personal favorite is the New King James Version, which says, "Now when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and behold, horror and great darkness fell upon him." Amen. What a blessing. We get another example of the Heebie Holies experience in Judges 6:20 to 23, when we come across a man named Gideon threshing wheat in a winepress. His people have been oppressed by the Midianites, basically because Gideon's people have acted like garbage and, quote, "did evil in the eyes of the Lord," end quote. An angel, hiding its nature, comes down and sits under an oak tree and greets Gideon. "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." It's a pretty awesome thing for a random stranger to say. It's a super aggressive compliment. Imagine going through the drive-thru at Taco Bell or Starbucks or even the grocery store in the checkout line and having someone say to you instead of, "May I take your order," "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Wow, thanks. Someone's getting a good tip. Gideon and the angel engage in some chit-chat about how God will help Israel, and Gideon asks for a sign. The sign arrives in the form of fire shooting out of a rock and consuming some meat. Immediately, Gideon says, "Alas, sovereign Lord, I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face." Even though the angel has been nothing but encouraging, the reveal of a divine being causes Gideon to lose it, to where the angel, like they've done many, many times before, has to say, "Peace, do not be afraid, you are not going to die." Not that they get exhausted like people do, but I wonder if there is some angelic equivalent of exasperation or anxiety when it comes to trying to talk to human beings. No matter how gentle they try to be, there's going to be an outburst like Casper, who just wants a friend but scares the daylights out of anyone he gets close to. These angel stories, also known as theophanies, are all throughout the Bible. Then there is Jesus, someone who has been described as meek and lowly. When you think of pictures or paintings of Jesus, what comes to mind? There's the one that often hangs in church lobbies called the Head of Christ, or sometimes Salmon Head, which is a portrait of Jesus painted by American artist Warner Salmon in 1940. Go ahead and Google it. I bet you've seen it before. The portrait has soft lighting. Jesus' hair looks soft and shiny like it could be in a shampoo commercial. His beard is neatly trimmed and his expression is passive. It's a very benign and peaceful picture, though the artist does fall into the trap of making him look more European than Middle Eastern. Other popular images of Jesus usually feature a hillside and him cradling a sheep, standing by the sea with flowing white robes, or teaching groups of people who sit quietly listening to what he has to say. Usually he's glowing. But even the meek and lowly Jesus terrifies people sometimes. One of my favorite moments is known as the Transfiguration in Matthew 17:1-2. Here's what the Bible says. "Now after 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John, his brother, led them up on a high mountain by themselves, and he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as the light. and behold, Moses and Elijah appeared to them, talking with him. The Greek word used for transfigured in this passage is metamorphothe, which is where we get the English word metamorphosis. Now, this is where most preachers will start waxing eloquent about butterflies. But butterflies don't scare people into talking nonsense and then faceplant in the dirt out of terror. In verse 3, Peter, known for his lack of filter, says, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, let us make here 3 tabernacles, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." Peter, you're a fisherman, not a contractor. There is no way you're going to DIY 3 tabernacles, even if you are handy. This is significant to me because, as brash and outspoken as he is, this phrase indicates being overwhelmed and at a loss of what to say in the presence of unveiled divinity. And we can't judge him, because what kind of nonsense would we say in this situation? The Theological Dictionary of the New Testament comments that the context is eschatological, or end times. What is promised for believers takes place already for Jesus as the bearer of a unique call. It shows that the glory of consummation is the goal of his way of suffering and death. This is not a mystical deification, but a reattachment of the divine likeness. There's a lot more to say about this incredible scene, but for now, know that it was overwhelming, and in the midst of it, a voice from heaven booms, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Hear him." Most people of faith, at least at some point in their journey, think that they would love a direct voice from heaven. We romanticize a shaft of light breaking through the clouds and bathing us in it, maybe a little bit of a choir singing in the background, and then the deep voice of James Earl Jones speaking encouraging words to us, and the smell of flowers all around us gives us an amazing, memorable, wonderful experience. And maybe that's happened for some people, but most of the time it looks like what happens in verse 6, quote, "And when the disciples heard it, they fell on their faces and were greatly afraid," end quote. This isn't the only time Jesus freaks someone out with his otherness. In Revelation 1:12-16, John encounters the risen and glorified Christ. In John's own words, here is what he saw. Quote, "Then I turned to see the voice that spoke with me, and having turned I saw 7 golden lampstands. In the midst of the 7 lampstands, one like the Son of Man, clothed with the garment down to his feet and girded about the chest with a golden band. His head and hair were white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes like a flame of fire. His feet were like fine brass, as if refined in a furnace, and his voice as the sound of many waters. He had in his right hand 7 stars. Out of his mouth went a sharp 2-edged sword, and his countenance was like the sun shining in its strength." End quote. Everything through white hair seems great, and then we get fire eyes, metallic skin, water voice, star holding, and sword mouth. Plus, if you've stared at the sun before, you know it doesn't feel great on the eyes. So Jesus, shining with the full strength of the sun, is overwhelming. John responds to the risen Savior the same way the Roman guards at the tomb did. Quote, "I fell at his feet as though dead." End quote. Jesus reaches down, picks John up, and tells him, you guessed it, don't be afraid. The pattern of God or his messengers consistently having to say, "Don't be afraid," implies that upon first contact, people encounter something that shivers their timbers so thoroughly that they pass out. There are lots of biblical passages like this. It makes for a fun afternoon of Bible study to hunt down all the verses where God and his angels freak people out, even though they have nothing but good intentions and blessings to give. Like Casper the friendly ghost, these heavenly hosts, these heavenly creatures, and even God himself call upon human beings often to be met with fear or misunderstanding. I want to suggest there is something scary about God, but not in the way Hollywood or extreme fundamentalist preachers distort God's character would have you believe. When you hear the word holiness, what do you think of? If someone is holy, what does that mean? Our colloquial usage of the term, or how we usually use it, is to denote something good. We gaze admiringly on someone we feel embodies a good character and is involved in spiritual things, and we say, "Mary is so holy." More often, though, we use it to judge people we see as pretending to be better than everybody else. "Look at Carl, he thinks he's so holy." The phrase "holier than thou" is a popular phrase that we use from time to time. It describes someone who pretends to be better than everyone else. In the early 1990s, Metallica released a song called "Holier Than Thou," which reflects lead singer James Hetfield's displeasure at people in the music industry who would quickly call out other people's mistakes as if they were perfect. there's a lot of ways the word gets used in sacred and secular contexts. The Bible attaches the term holy to God many times. Exodus 15:11 says, "The Lord is majestic in holiness." Often preachers take that to mean his moral perfection, and we exhort people to strive to be holy or worship God in the beauty of holiness. Again, how we define the biblical term usually ends up being about good behavior. I recently heard a ridiculous sermon where the preacher defined holiness as being quiet in an attempt to get the church to conform to 19th century Anglo-centric norms of worship expression. While holiness can inspire silence, that isn't what it's about. That's not its core definition. It's not really about goodness or behavior either. So, what does the term mean? In his classic work, The Idea of Holiness, Rudolf Otto looks at what he calls the mysterium tremendum, or the terrifying but sacred experience that occurs when a created creature encounters their divine creator. He looks at the Hebrew term kadosh and the Greek term hagios. He suggests that the term contains a, quote, ineffable quality, end quote, which simply means it has an indescribable quality. Think of trying to describe ice cream to someone who has never tasted it before, or trying to capture the grandeur of a mountain range for a person who has never left Kansas. Try to describe what it's like to have your team win the Super Bowl to a Minnesota Vikings fan. Words or even pictures simply can't articulate the entire experience. The concept of holiness contains the idea of something beyond our categories and capacities. In Latin, Greek, and Semitic languages, Otto writes that holy contains a overplus meaning. He puts forth a new term crafted from the Latin numen, which means divine power over something, and omen, which means ominous, to create the word numinous. And an encounter with this numinous contains the, quote, raw material of religious humility, end quote. It means, essentially, other, something beyond, different, set apart. It doesn't exclude concepts like goodness and moral perfection, but the emphasis seems to be on otherness, the otherness of God. An otherness that breaks our preconceived categories, exceeds our rational frameworks, and goes beyond our human experience. While that may sound refreshing and exhilarating for some, the usual result, according to the Bible, is to sprawl out on the ground, plant your face in the dirt, and pray for mercy. What also fascinates me about this definition of holiness as otherness is its connection to the word monster. Like holiness, we have a popular use of the word monster that doesn't reflect its etymology or its original meaning. Most of the time when we say monster, we mean something scary, bad, or evil. We use monster to describe serial killers, like Jeffrey Dahmer was a monster. Or we might say Netflix is a monster in their dramatizing of a serial killer in a way that causes victims' families to relive trauma just so the media company can make a buck. Occasionally, we use it to describe something of surprisingly great size. I love this restaurant. They serve monster portions. Or, let's go to the monster truck rally. We also use it to market the power of products like Monster energy drinks. However, the term monstrum from 12th century Latin meant divine omen, portent, or sign. It could also mean abnormal shape, which then lent itself to being a metaphor for things out of shape or even repulsive. In the early 14th century, the Old French monstre referred to malformed animals or humans and birth defects, something other than what was deemed normal by society. It was also derived from moner, which means to warn, advise, instruct, or teach. To simplify, monster comes from the idea of otherness and difference connected with divine signs used to teach others. Because of this, in my classroom and in settings like this, I have adjusted my meaning of the word monster and holiness to reflect otherness rather than strictly evil or good. God and the beings God sends are wholly other. They are beyond our human capacities and experience. This becomes especially obvious when we start looking at how the Bible describes angels in books like Ezekiel. They aren't plump, rosy-cheeked cherubs with harps adorning heart-shaped boxes of chocolate. In chapter 1, the prophet Ezekiel sees a whirlwind and tells us, quote, "Also from within it came the likeness of 4 living creatures, and this was their appearance. They had the likeness of a man. Each one had 4 faces, and each one had 4 wings. Their legs were straight, and the soles of their feet were like the soles of calves' feet. They sparkled like the color of burnished bronze. The hands of a man were under their wings, on their 4 sides, and each of the 4 had faces and wings." So, to recap, we have humanoid, 4-faced, 4-winged, calf-footed entities that sparkle. And as an added bonus, under those feathery white wings you might be envisioning, there'd be some hands, apparently not attached to any arms. Somehow, I don't think this angelic being will ever be painted on the wall of a nursery, and I don't remember the children's classes at church having felts of this figure when they were teaching us our lessons. The description continues in verse 10, quote, "As for the likeness of their faces, each had the face of a man, each of the four had the face of a lion on the right side, each of the four had the face of an ox on the left side, and each of the four had the face of an eagle," end quote. It sort of reminds me of Many Faces from He-Man, a guy who could shift his face around in a weird quasi-robotic helmet to reflect a variety of moods and personalities.
Well, we got the room all decorated, so where's the big surprise?
Right there. If you don't care for monsters, perhaps you prefer a robot.
What is your command?
Hey, I know who that is. It's Many Faces.
At your service.
Accompanying these multifaceted or multifaceted creatures, we learn that they had wheels next to them. While most vehicles have something called a flywheel, these angels apparently have an eye wheel. No, not an Apple product, I mean wheels with eyeballs. Quote, "Their rims were high and awesome, and all four rims were full of eyes all around. When the living creatures moved, the wheels beside them moved, and when the living creatures rose from the ground, the wheels also rose. Wherever the Spirit would go, they would go, and the wheels would rise along with them, because the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels." Some creative people on the internet have actually crafted biblically accurate Christmas tree toppers based off of this. You can find them on Etsy, and if anyone is listening out there that is wanting to get me a Christmas present, I would love one. I promise to put it on my tree and take a picture of it and post it on social media. When these eye wheels got cranked up, they made more noise than that guy in your neighborhood who drives up and down the street on his Harley Davidson. Ezekiel says, "I heard the sound of their wings like the roar of rushing waters, and the voice of the Almighty like the tumult of an army." There are many ways to interpret the striking images here, but the effect on old Zeke is what we might expect from the Heebie Holies. He ends the chapter with, "So when I saw it, I fell on my face." It's an interesting exercise to go through the Bible and read holiness texts with the lens of otherness. Notice how God frequently asserts this element of otherness in places like Exodus 9:14, where God says, quote, "There is no one like me in all the earth," end quote. So how is all this inspiring? How are the Heebie Holies adding to our picture of God? In C.S. Lewis's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Susan asks Mr. Beaver if Aslan, the lion who represents Christ, is safe. "Course he isn't safe," replies Mr. Beaver, "but he is good." Toward the end of the novel, Aslan slips away and the children remember another set of instructions from Mr. Beaver. "One day you'll see him and another you won't. He's wild, you know, not a tame lion." The intersection of holiness, otherness, and horror in the sense of being overwhelmed lends to a wildness and an unpredictability to God, someone that doesn't always fit our neat theological frameworks, timelines, and metaphors, someone who can still surprise us. That is what makes hunting after such a being exciting, frustrating, challenging, and even fun. Perhaps hunting the holy is what leads people to worship as they feel their own creatureliness in the presence of God's otherness. Thank you for listening to Beast and Bible. I hope you enjoyed this episode and are inspired to hunt the holy, which almost sounds like a tagline for the podcast, Hunt the Holy. Maybe I'll use that more in the future. But of course, our discussion today brings up another issue related to monsters and otherness. If they elude our categories, if they're so other that they break all our preconceived conceptions, how do we understand them or learn to read them when they appear in sacred texts and in popular texts? Join me next time when we look at a framework for analyzing monsters known as Monster Theory. Hosted, written, and produced by Dr. Seth Pierce. Edited by Andrew Ashley. Logo design and social media by Chelsea Ernina. Tech equipment and support by Steve Husett and James Gigante. Project support by Heather Moore. Special thanks to the North American Division and the Adventist Learning Community for making this podcast possible.
An Adventist Learning Community podcast.